What if I told you that the man who once had the power to decide the value of America's treasures is now facing a life that's the complete opposite? A man once seen as a symbol of wealth and influence, Rick Harrison, is no longer running his pawn shop. Instead, he's become just another item being traded in the dark world of daily survival. From a well-known business mogul, he's now struggling with trivial things like cleaning brushes and spoiled food, just to make it through another day. How did someone who once stood as a symbol of success end up in such a tragic situation? And the bigger question is, why did no one step in to stop this downfall? It all began with the harsh clang of steel against steel, marking the moment when the relationships and forces surrounding Rick began to reveal their true nature. That was the first shock, and the beginning of a series of unpredictable events that would lead him down a tragic path no one could reverse. You're probably really curious about what's going on with Rick Harrison in jail, right? If you think this is an exciting and dramatic story, leave a comment with the number 1. If not, comment with the number 0. Don't forget to like, share the video, and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on more exciting videos. Now let's dive into the story. The echo wasn't just bouncing off the walls, it pierced deep into your bones, making it clear that from that moment on, your life was no longer your own. When Rick Harrison, the cheerful face of the Pawn Stars, walked into the inmate intake center, handcuffed and numb, that echo was the first thing to greet him. No red carpet, no buzzing of camera shutters, just cold metal and even colder stares. Before we continue, please hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell to stay updated. The velvet ropes of Las Vegas limelight had disappeared. In their place was a concrete floor soaked in history, and dozens of suspicious eyes evaluating him as if he were the latest item to be appraised. Rick's descent into the underground world of prison life didn't happen slowly. It wasn't a slow burn. It was immediate, violent, and all-encompassing. One day, he was a cultural icon known for negotiating prices with a wide smile. The next, he was a federal inmate convicted of human trafficking and money laundering, locked up in one of the most notorious correctional facilities in the country. And what happened next? No one could have scripted it, not even the writers of his hit TV show. According to an insider, a prisoner who chose to remain anonymous out of fear of retaliation, Rick Harrison became the subject of a twisted joke behind bars. In a cruel irony that few could endure, his fellow inmates turned his legacy into his own worst enemy, forcing him to pawn his belongings just to survive. This is not a metaphor. This is not an exaggeration. It is his reality. This is a world where ramen noodles, toothpaste, and the last scraps of dignity become currency for survival. And in that grim economy, Rick, the expert in transactions, the master of negotiation, is learning that some prices are too high. Because here, he's not appraising ancient swords or rare coins. He's negotiating for his safety night after night. And exactly what is happening behind those locked doors? What does pawning in prison really mean? What does Rick have left to trade? And more importantly, who is making these exchanges? We'll uncover all of that. But first, let's rewind. The fall of Rick Harrison's empire didn't happen overnight, although to the public it certainly seemed that way. The initial whispers about illegal dealings, whispered behind closed doors and in hushed tones around the pawnshop counter, were dismissed as rumors. No one really wanted to believe that the star of one of America's most beloved reality TV shows could be involved in something as horrific as human trafficking. But then the evidence surfaced. Wire transfers, surveillance footage, secret recordings, and then the crash. A grand jury handed down the indictment. Investigators connected Rick to a larger, more expansive international network of illicit activity, accusing him of money laundering through front businesses linked to his Las Vegas pawn empire. And even more horrifically, they alleged that some of those transactions were linked to the trafficking of vulnerable individuals, primarily women, many of whom were undocumented, some believed to be minors. The news hit like a lightning bolt. Fans were stunned. Former staff distanced themselves. Sponsors vanished overnight. Pawn Stars was pulled from reruns in several countries. Rick, calm and silent throughout the trial, maintained his innocence. But ultimately, the evidence overwhelmed the charm. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, a sentence that many believed he might never serve due to his age and health. That should have been the end of the story. But for Rick Harrison, it was only the beginning of a much darker chapter. Hours after being processed into the prison system, Rick encountered something far more terrifying than the gavel of the judge or the prosecutor's cold stare. Justice for prisoners here is different. There are no cameras, no scripted episodes, only raw survival. And the inmates? They're not starstruck. They're opportunists. The first source to reveal the story, a man who claimed to serve meals in Rick's unit, described a surreal scene. He just sat there, staring at the wall like it had the answers, the inmate said. Next thing I know, some guy from Cell Block C walks over to him with a toothbrush and says, "Let's see what you'll pay me for this Pawn Star." Everyone laughed. Rick did not. What started as a cruel joke quickly escalated, faster than anyone, even Rick, could have predicted. Within a week, Rick was encouraged, a polite term, to trade his sneakers for a pair of worn sandals. The snacks in his store were gone. His first care package from his legal counsel was sent off before he could even finish reading the accompanying letter. But this wasn't just bullying, it was systematic. There is a hierarchy in prison, an unspoken rule that determines who holds power and who doesn't. And within that structure, Rick's reputation didn't elevate him. It painted a target on his back. To many of the more ruthless inmates, he wasn't a celebrity. He was a resource, a walking stockpile. They didn't want to kill him. They wanted to use him, drain him dry until there was nothing left. Inmate number 44792A, a name we've changed for privacy reasons, explained it the clearest. It's like watching someone run their own TV show, but in reverse. Instead of people bringing stuff into cell, we take it piece by piece. And if he resists, he'll be reminded of the price to pay. The price to pay. That's the obsession. According to multiple sources, Rick endured a level of psychological torment that few could imagine. Every week he was forced into mock negotiations where fellow inmates made him assign value to trivial items. Socks, a roll of toilet paper, a broken spoon. They filmed with smuggled phones, they laughed, and he played along not because he wanted to, but because he had learned the consequences of saying no. The guards, some intervened, most did not. Even among the staff, there was an understanding that celebrities break in a certain way behind bars. This is not justice. This is humiliation with rules. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. Because what's happening to Rick Harrison isn't just a twisted mockery of the life he once lived. It's also a reflection of something darker. A system where power is not determined by money, influence, or history, but by what you're willing to give up just to see another day. Rick's story is still unfolding, and what you're about to learn in the following chapters may change the way you think, not just about celebrities, but about the price of survival in a world where no one cares who you were before that prison door slams shut. To most Americans, Rick Harrison is a familiar face, a regular guy with a keen eye for what's valuable, a sarcastic tone, and a talent for making history interesting. His gravelly voice, iconic goatee, and straightforward attitude made the Pawn Stars a cultural phenomenon. He didn't look like a TV star, and that was part of his charm. He came across as down-to-earth, approachable, and real. Behind the counter at the Gold and Silver Pawn Shop in Las Vegas, Rick built a brand that became synonymous with trustworthiness and knowledge. Over time, fans didn't just see him as a businessman. They saw him as someone who could distinguish between a genuine Civil War artifact and a cleverly crafted replica. The man valued the stories behind the items as much as their price. So when the headlines started appearing, no one knew what to believe. It all began quietly. A few whispers on obscure forums. Then, a report filed in a Nevada court, sealed but noted in the public index, revealed that Rick was under investigation by federal authorities. Fans brushed it off. After all, celebrities are always being investigated. But when the FBI officially announced the scope of their probe into an underground trafficking and money laundering operation centered around businesses in Las Vegas, the mood began to shift. Rick's name was mentioned in the third paragraph. He wasn't just connected to the scandal. According to prosecutors, he was one of the architects of it. The courtroom on sentencing day was a paradox of silence and tension. All cameras were blocked, every phone turned off, but the weight of that moment still reverberated in the air. Rick sat next to his legal team, his face unreadable as the judge recounted the charges in an unwavering voice. Fraud through wire transfers, money laundering, aiding and abetting, and human trafficking conspiracy. A few rows ahead, an elderly woman gasped as the judge uttered the words, "minor." A younger man sitting beside her placed his hand on his head. Rick's eldest son, Corey, wasn't in the room. There were no actors or business partners present, only strangers, journalists, and court-appointed sketch artists. The prosecution presented a chilling timeline. According to investigators, Rick had intentionally allowed his pawn shop and the businesses behind it to be used as a hub for money laundering to profit from forced labor and human trafficking operations. The money flowed through seemingly legitimate transactions disguised as sales of vintage memorabilia and rare items. But that money was dirty, and the people behind it were even darker. Evidence included secret bank accounts in the Cayman Islands, testimonies from survivors of human trafficking, and surveillance footage of suspicious deliveries made after hours at a hidden entrance behind the shop. Some of Rick's security personnel turned on him, offering testimony that no defense could counter. But perhaps the most damning piece of evidence was a series of voice recordings. In one of these clips, Rick was allegedly heard speaking with a man who ran one of the shell corporations linked to the human trafficking operation. In one snippet, Rick was supposedly heard saying, "Just make sure the paperwork runs through the usual box. If anyone asks, it's at the museum level. Don't worry about it." The courtroom fell silent as the audio played. For many who had grown up watching Rick haggle over guitars and samurai swords, that voice was unmistakable, familiar, cold. The defense tried to argue that Rick had been duped, that he was a businessman caught in a vast criminal network operating in the shadows of his legitimate empire. But the timeline didn't add up. Financial records showed too many consistent patterns, emails directly linked to his personal accounts. The connections were undeniable. The judge delivered the sentence without flair, 28 years in federal prison, without the possibility of parole. There was a pause as the room absorbed the weight of those words. Then, the officer silently stepped behind Rick, and the shackles were fastened. He didn't resist. He didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead. Within moments of the announcement, the media exploded. Former fans flooded social media with disbelief, denial, and in some cases, anger. The broadcasters couldn't contain their shock. Networks that had once aired his show ran dramatic recreations, juxtaposing his on-screen charm with the courtroom sketches, a stark contrast. Pawn Stars was quickly removed from most streaming platforms. Merchandise deals were canceled, sponsors fled. What had once been a cultural staple was now radioactive. The legacy of the show crumbled overnight. For Rick, the consequences went far beyond public scrutiny. Businesses bearing his name, side projects, restaurant deals, branded merchandise, and media contracts collapsed within weeks. Investors pulled out. Partners erased all connections. In a cruel irony, some fans began selling off their Rick Harrison merchandise online, often noting in the listings, "Sell before it becomes worthless." But the financial losses were just part of the story. Behind the scenes, personal relationships deteriorated quickly. Family members made no public statements. Close friends either disappeared or publicly distanced themselves, denying any involvement in Rick's dealings. Corey, his son and former co-star, had erased all traces of his father from social media and declined interviews. The silence was louder than any accusation. What remained was a man stripped of everything: his fame, his wealth, his family, and his freedom. Yet in the months following his incarceration, new questions began to surface. Whispers among law enforcement, rumors from insiders, speculation that Rick wasn't just involved, but was being silenced. Some believed he had been made to take the fall for something bigger. That powerful, unseen names, untouchable, were using Rick as a buffer to protect themselves from exposure. Others believed he got exactly what he deserved. One thing was clear: his life would never be the same. The pawn shop he had built from the ground up was closed, shuttered by federal orders. The once iconic sign had faded, its light extinguished. Tourists no longer came. Fans no longer inquired. The world had moved on, but Rick was only beginning to pay the price. And inside the prison walls, that price would become painfully literal. This is where the story goes deeper, where the courtroom ends and survival begins. And as you'll soon see, Rick Harrison's real sentence didn't come from the judge. It came from the prisoners waiting for him. They say the first night in prison is always the longest. For Rick Harrison, it was something much worse. It was the defining night of his life. And there were no TV cameras, no film crews, no witty voiceovers to soften the reality that unfolded after the last gate slammed shut behind him. Everything leading up to that moment had felt surreal. The trial, the sentencing, the journey to the facility. But now, there were no courtrooms, no lawyers, and no illusions of control. This was federal prison, a place designed not just to incarcerate, but to strip away every trace of who you were before you arrived. Rick stepped out of the transport van in silence, shackled at the wrists and ankles. The sky above was bleak, casting a shadow over the midday sun. The air felt different, heavy with history, resentment, and unwritten rules that every prisoner inside knew, even if they weren't posted on any walls. He was greeted not with aggression, but with a cold indifference that sent a clear message. His past meant nothing here. The guards handled him swiftly. His mugshot was taken under flickering fluorescent lights, capturing a hollow version of the man that the audience once knew. He showed no emotion, no coldness, no fear, just emptiness, like someone mentally rehearsing the days ahead in an endless loop. They stripped him of everything. His watch, his belt, his personal items, and his dignity. The jumpsuit they gave him was stiff, faded orange. The number on the back not only identified him, but erased him. Then the guards gave him a warning, not a threat, but a truth. He would be entering general population. One of them, one of us, one guard said, not even bothering to look up from his clipboard. It's best to keep your head down. Everyone knows who he is. Rick nods once. No questions, no reaction. But inside, he must have known. Everything was about to change. The walk to the holding unit is eerily quiet. The echo of distant shouts, the clatter of metal, and the slam of doors make up the only sounds. Other inmates lean against the walls or sit quietly on the metal benches, watching him pass by. Some recognize him immediately, others stare vacantly. Their interest isn't in who he is, but in what he might bring to their world. A celebrity entering the general population is a rare event, and rare things in prison don't stay rare for long. As he steps into the assigned unit, the dynamics shift. His new environment isn't violent, at least not on the surface, but it hums with tension like an unconnected electric wire buzzing through the walls. The narrow bunk beds were stacked on top of each other like cages. The windows were sealed with thick glass, and the lights never fully went out. Rick was assigned the bottom bunk in a two-person cell. His new cellmate, a man named Brody with tattoos spreading across his neck, looked up and muttered, "Great, a TV star." That was the welcome. Brody didn't offer a handshake, didn't move from his spot on the bed. He just stared at Rick, letting the silence stretch as long as needed. Rick didn't try to make small talk. He knew better. He unpacked what little he had, a thin blanket, a plastic cup, and a toothbrush too flimsy to clean anything but his hope. The first night passed in fragments. The sounds of prison never stopped. Coughs, footsteps, distant shouting. Somewhere, a man cried quietly into his pillow. Every sound bounced off the concrete, amplified into noise. Sleep didn't come, not fully. Rick lay on his back, staring up at the bunk above, the cold creeping through the mattress, wondering what he had become. But it wasn't until morning that the real change began. The news spread fast. Before Rick had a chance to eat breakfast, the whispers turned into comments. Across the starry sky, someone hissed as he walked by. Another man muttered, "How much are you worth now, Rick?" Some laughed, but most watched, curious, calculating. It wasn't the fame that drew attention in prison. It was what you could offer, or what others could take. At breakfast, Rick sat alone. He kept his eyes down, but the weight of dozens of eyes felt like 100 steps pressing down on him. The trays clattered, feet shuffled, and just as he was about to take the first bite of his warm oatmeal, someone slid into the seat opposite him. The man was tall, skinny, and grinning broadly. His name wasn't given, but the authority in his body language was unmistakable. A leader, not of an official prison unit, but of something more significant. Influence, power, control. "You're Rick," the man said, tapping the table lightly twice. "I know you. My mom loves your show." Rick didn't answer. The man didn't expect him to. He just smiled wider, then leaned in closer. "The thing is, Rick, here you don't have your shop. You don't have your counter, but you've got something else." He pointed to Rick's jumpsuit. "That name, that face. It's worth something. And if you're smart, you'll let us decide how much it's worth." Then he stood up, patted Rick on the shoulder, and walked away. It wasn't a threat. It was a deal, the kind that wasn't really optional. By lunchtime, Rick understood what was going on. Two men approached him in the yard, both wearing the same fake, courteous expressions. They didn't touch him. They didn't even speak. But they handed him a list of things they expected him to provide by the end of the week. Items from his orders at the shop and anything he could get from the outside. It was scribbled on a torn napkin with a pin. At the bottom of the paper, there was a cold, capitalized note: "Pay up or be valued." Rick folded the paper and walked away. He didn't go to the guards. He didn't speak to his cellmate. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the paper for about an hour. That night, he gave up his pillow. 2 days later, he gave up his socks. By the weekend, he had nothing left. And the worst part was, they weren't finished. It didn't take long for the other inmates to realize that they had something more valuable than cigarettes or a commissary among them. They had a man whose face had once been broadcast on primetime television. A man who had built a career negotiating deals, appraising others' items, and telling stories about artifacts with great historical value. A living, ironic spectacle. And the inmates? They had become the new cast. They just didn't need the cameras to run their show. It all started with small things. After word spread that Rick had gone along with the demands, other inmates started trying their luck. They'd walk up with trivial items, a broken paperclip, a shoelace, a dented food tray, and ask Rick with mocking curiosity, "How much you think this is worth?" At first he ignored them, but it didn't take long for ignoring to become a dangerous choice. In prison, silence can be mistaken for arrogance, or worse, defiance. So one day, Rick finally responded. 5 cents, he muttered when a tattooed inmate shoved a torn paperback in his face. The group around the man burst out laughing. It wasn't the appraisal that cracked them up. It was the fact that Rick had answered. He was playing their game now. That was their first win. By the following week, the game had rules. Every Tuesday and Friday during rec time, Rick was expected to take part in what the inmates mockingly called Pawn Hour. They'd set up plastic bins in the yard. Inmates would bring items, sometimes real, often ridiculous, and Rick would be forced to appraise them, not because they cared about the value, but because they wanted to see him squirm. One guy brought an old toilet brush and demanded an evaluation. Another handed Rick a torn page from a comic book. Someone else showed up with a pair of stained underwear. Rick didn't want to play, but refusing came with consequences. At first, it was subtle. Food dumped on his bed, toilet water splashed on his pillow. Eventually, a work shift token was placed on his tray, wrapped in a napkin, with no words and no room for negotiation. So he played. He assigned values, spun backstories, told them what the item might fetch on a fake black market exchange. They laughed, mocked, jeered. Sometimes they recorded it on contraband phones. Rumor had it the clips even made their way onto the dark web. A former celebrity reduced to a court jester, appraising worthless items just to avoid a beating, or worse. But it didn't stop there. The show evolved. It became more elaborate. They started calling it Yard Stars, a cruel twist on the original title. Rick wasn't just forced to participate anymore. He was forced to host. They even made him wear a cardboard badge cut from a cereal box with manager scrawled above a fake serial number. The inmates running the show, a loose alliance of gang leaders and hustlers, took turns choosing the theme for each session. One week it was kitchen utensils, the next contraband specials. Someone even dragged in a broken mop handle and pretended it was a medieval spear. Rick had to play along. He wasn't allowed to be sarcastic. He wasn't allowed to refuse. He had to respond as if those objects mattered, and he had to give them a dollar value. Sometimes, if he didn't, they'd force him to trade real items from his commissary just to get them back. The irony wasn't lost on everyone. The man who once paid cash for antiques was now giving up ramen noodles and bar soap just to avoid punishment. One inmate joked that Rick had finally become the pawn. It might have been funny if it weren't so humiliating. Even the guards saw it happening. Some snickered, others just looked the other way. One was reportedly heard saying, "He made millions mocking people's stuff. Now look at him." There was no sympathy, no intervention, just a warped game unfolding unchecked out in the yard. Then came the punishment rounds. These were the darkest moments, and they were deliberately scheduled. If Rick got it wrong, if he gave the wrong value or failed to make the crowd laugh, the leaders running the game would start handing out punishments. Sometimes it was a day without food. Other times it was something more psychological. One day, after Rick refused to give a high value to a worn-out shoe brought by an aggressive inmate, he returned to his cell to find his mattress soaked in toilet water. Another time, after he sarcastically answered a ridiculous question about a paperclip, someone spat into his food tray before he could even eat. He stopped resisting after that. The worst punishment came a few weeks later. Rick was given a fake item, a roll of toilet paper wrapped in aluminum foil, supposed to be a telescope from the Titanic. When he refused to play along, he was dragged to the bathroom and left there for hours, while the others laughed from behind the locked gates. He didn't speak for 2 days after that. News spread quickly to other units. Prisoners from different sections began requesting transfers just so they could watch the show. For them, it was entertainment. For Rick, it was survival in its most brutal form. And then something changed. One of the game leaders, a man known as Crater, approached Rick with an offer. Crater said he wanted Rick to start appraising real items. The items were smuggled through the underground network within the prison. Phones, knives, drugs. They wanted Rick to play the part of a fake quality inspector. His job was to tell them if the goods looked like the real deal. Rick tried to resist. "I don't know anything about this," he said. Crater smiled. "You didn't know anything about a Viking axe either, but you made it work." The pressure was real, and the consequences were clear. From that day on, Rick was pulled deeper into the prison's illicit ecosystem. Every few nights, he would be taken to a corner of the yard or the laundry room, where someone would present him with an object, sometimes contraband, other times something stolen from another inmate, and ask for a value or a judgment. If Rick said it was fake or broken, the item would be discarded. If he said it had value, it would be put into circulation. At the time, he didn't realize it, but he was gradually becoming part of a larger machine, a pawnbroker in a black market from which he couldn't escape. The more he played, the deeper he sank. And the deeper he fell, the more dangerous everything became. Because now, Rick was no longer just a man trying to survive. He was an asset. And in a place where value is determined by fear, reputation, and control, Rick Harrison learned a truth he had never faced behind his counter. Here, you couldn't escape a bad deal. You survive. The guards never see it. Or maybe they saw but didn't care. Either way, by the 3rd month of Rick Harrison's incarceration, this had become common knowledge among the prisoners. Rick now belonged to someone. Not in a legal sense, not even in an institutional sense. In prison, ownership means something else. It wasn't about paperwork or control. It was about influence, fear, leverage. It was about knowing that a man was so broken, so desperate, that you could make him do anything you wanted and he wouldn't resist. Because resistance meant pain, isolation, or worse. And in Rick's case, the concept of ownership wasn't just abstract. It had a name. It had a structure. That structure was horrifyingly revealed in detail by an inmate who agreed to speak anonymously from within the facility. We'll call him Dante, a mid-level gang member with ties to 2 different housing units and access to both the yard operations and kitchen shifts. Dante was not a fan of Rick Harrison. He didn't care about the man's past or his TV persona, but what he saw unfold, he said, was not just punishment. It was institutionalized humiliation. "I won't lie," Dante admitted, his voice low and careful. "When he first came in, a lot of us thought he'd be dead within a month. We thought someone would catch him in the bathroom or maybe on his way back from using the restroom, but that didn't happen," Dante explained. "Instead, something more useful took root. There's always someone here who sees an opportunity. Rick wasn't seen as a threat. He was seen as a prize. Not because of his money. That's gone. Not because of his influence. It didn't mean anything here, but because he had once been someone who knew value, understood the craft, and knew how to negotiate, they thought that if they could get him in their pocket, he'd become a tool, a mascot, and a spokesman. That opportunity was seized by a small group of inmates who ran an internal economy. A black market network operated across various wings of the prison. They traded store protection, stolen goods, and contraband. They decided Rick would become their broker, not officially, not by title, but by function. They approached him one night in the rec yard. No threats, no weapons, just a simple proposition. "You help us run the deals and we'll keep you safe. You don't? You figure it out." Dante witnessed this. He stood just 20 feet away, pretending to sweep the walkway as the conversation unfolded. "I remember how Rick stood," Dante said, as if trying not to fall. "His knees were shaking, and when they made the offer, he didn't even look up." He just nodded once, as if he knew there was no other choice. From that moment, Rick's role shifted from a passive target to an active participant in the prison hierarchy. The group controlling him operated with military precision. They had lieutenants, runners, scouts, and muscle. They referred to themselves as the Scale, not because of justice or balance, but because, as one of them was said to joke, "We weigh what matters here." Rick had become a valuable asset to the Scale. His job, to authenticate deals, appraise stolen or questionable goods, and act as the face of impartial evaluations in disputes between gangs. If anyone thought they were being swindled in a deal, Rick would be called in to inspect the items and make a judgment. Dante explained, "It sounds silly from the outside, like some weird game, but here it matters. A fight over a bad deal could turn into a stabbing. So having someone who can pretend to be impartial, someone who looks the part, helps keep everything under control. Rick was the fake arbitrator, and they made him feel like it was the only thing keeping him alive. But Rick wasn't just used for negotiations. The group used his voice, his face, and his name. They forced him to introduce himself to the smugglers under the guise of being connected to a famous person. They convinced the new inmates that Rick was the key to moving goods within the prison. In one instance, Dante said Rick was caught standing in the laundry room, telling a new inmate that a pack of smuggled cigarettes would be sold for 3 times the price outside the building. It was all an act, but it worked. In return, the group promised to protect him. Protection came with conditions. Rick wasn't allowed to talk to the guards unless he had to. He wasn't allowed to share his groceries with anyone outside the group. He was required to report anything he heard. Rumors, escape plans, snitches, hidden treasure. In short, he had become the prison version of a corporate man. They called him a pawn. Dante said it almost as a play on words because he was small to them. Not just in size, in strength, but even that protection had its limits. Rick still faced near-daily humiliation. The pawn shop hour continued, but now it was coordinated, controlled, filmed more frequently, sometimes edited, and sent through flash drives. Rick was instructed to smile, to laugh loudly, to act as if he was enjoying the game. It created the illusion that he was a voluntary participant. But behind closed doors, back in his cell, the mask slipped off. Dante recalled one night when Rick was allowed to shower alone under the guard's watch. He was then escorted back through the kitchen where Dante was working. He looked like he hadn't slept in a week. "I was walking underwater." But he complied every time. Because even though the guards could look the other way, Rick knew one thing more clearly than most. What happens when you break a deal? He had learned that from both sides of the counter. Over time, even prisoners who weren't part of the hierarchy began to treat Rick like an asset. They would walk past him and make fake offers. "I'll give you 2 bowls of soup for that wrist," a man sneered. "How much for your last bit of courage?" another joked. The issue wasn't the words. The issue was asserting power. Rick never reacted. As for the guards, they kept their official distance. On paper, Rick was a model prisoner. No outbursts, no altercations, no rule violations. But inside, those who saw beyond the surface knew better. He was surviving, but not living. Dante was clear. He was in a cage within another cage, a cage made of threats, debts, and fear. And they would never open that cage. And then one day, everything changed again. Rick collapsed. No one knew why. One moment, he was walking toward the store with an empty tray. The next, he was on the floor, shaking, unresponsive. The guards surrounded him. The prisoners were ushered out. Emergency protocols were initiated. And as he was taken away, a whisper spread like wildfire through the cell blocks. Finally, he had broken. But others weren't so sure. Some believed Rick didn't collapse from stress or exhaustion, but from something darker. A needle, a poisoning, a message. And that story began to take shape as well. To truly understand what happened to Rick Harrison behind the prison walls, one must grasp how a prison operates, not the version seen in movies, not the staged reality TV show, and certainly not the boring reality series Rick himself once headlined. Life in prison isn't actually managed by the administration or even the guards, but by an invisible network of power. A brutal, well-organized, constantly shifting network. Inside, there is a hierarchy, a savage social structure, where every inmate is ranked, evaluated, and assigned value, not by their sentence, but by how useful they are to others. In this world, Rick Harrison, a former celebrity, now an incarcerated criminal, is no longer someone special. In fact, his fame made him more vulnerable. As soon as he entered the general population, his value wasn't measured by his past, but by what others could exploit from him in the present. And make no mistake, they exploited everything. Power in prison comes from many sources: physical strength, numbers, connections with outside support, but above all, it comes from fear. If others fear you, you have control. If you fear others, you belong to them. There are many layers in the prison food chain. At the top are the gang leaders who run the entire operation from within their cells. They control the flow of drugs, contraband, phones, and illicit transactions. They rarely get their hands dirty because they don't need to. Orders are passed down through a chain of lieutenants to the soldiers who carry them out with brutal efficiency. Below them are the influencers, not social media stars, but prisoners who manage communication between groups, maintain peace, or stir up conflict when it's convenient. These men hold information as currency. Then there are the runners, young prisoners who follow orders from those above them in exchange for small favors or protection. These are the ones who relay messages, hide contraband, and start fights when told to. At the bottom, the assets. These are prisoners with no power, no protection, no leverage. They are exploited, passed around, humiliated. Some break quickly, others endure longer, resisting in small ways. But in the end, most learn that resistance is futile. Rick didn't start at the bottom, but he didn't belong at the top either. He landed somewhere in the middle. A man with a recognizable face, a story that others could twist and exploit, and just enough fame to attract attention. It was both a curse and a currency. Because in prison, attention was never neutral. Almost immediately, factions began circling Rick like vultures. These groups weren't always based on race or gangs. Sometimes, they formed around shared geography or common crimes. Other times, they were simply collections of like-minded individuals who carved out territories. A table in the mess hall, a section of the yard, a corner of the shower. Rick was valued for what he could bring: information, influence, even entertainment. But there was disagreement on how to approach him. Some groups wanted to recruit him, others wanted to exploit him. A few saw him as a threat, not because of strength, but because he could attract attention from the outside world. That made him a liability. The last group to control Rick, known internally as the Scale, didn't do so through violence. They did it through structure. They had a plan, and Rick fit into it perfectly. They introduced him to their internal operations gradually. First, by assigning him harmless tasks, like assisting in evaluating trade deals between prisoners, and then using his face, voice, and staged transactions. Eventually, they gave him responsibility in their larger underground economy. Rick was allowed to survive because he served a function, but even while he played their game, he still wasn't truly part of their world. He was a puppet on a string, a borrowed tool, a convenience, and everyone else knew it. Other groups grew resentful of the Scale for monopolizing Rick's presence. Rumors began to spread that he was being too well protected, that he could provide information to the guards, that he was a burden who could cause a lockdown. Tensions increased, and the deeper Rick was pulled into the Scale's system, the more exposed he became. He had to walk a fine line between compliance and self-preservation. Every deal he accepted, every item he valued, became a potential trigger for conflict. A prisoner described the atmosphere as radioactive. Everyone was watching Rick. Everyone was measuring his moves. And everyone was wondering how much longer it would take before someone exploded in anger. But Rick wasn't just under pressure from rival factions. He was also being crushed from the top down. The leaders of the Scale were not patient people. They expected results. When transactions failed, when goods didn't move according to plan, or when an item Rick approved turned out to be worthless, he was punished. Not physically, but later. First, they isolated him, forcing him to eat alone, denying him access to the yard. Then came the insults, threats, and disciplinary tasks that Rick was ordered to carry out. Cleaning the toilets without gloves, scrubbing the floor until his knees bled, or sitting in the cold laundry room for hours as a form of silent reprimand. And when that didn't work, they turned to humiliation. The infamous pawn show was amped up. More prisoners attended. Rick was under even more pressure to perform. He was forced to wear props, fake glasses, cardboard badges, even a temporary name tag that read, "Trash Manager." If he refused, he would be beaten. They slowly, methodically broke him down. If you find this story interesting, don't forget to hit the like button, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss out on more exciting videos. Now let's continue with the story. Dante, the prisoner who revealed much of this information, mentioned that Rick's behavioral changes were hard to ignore. At first, he tried to keep himself composed. He walked upright, held his head high. But over time, he began to shrink. Not physically, but mentally. It was as though his soul grew smaller with each passing week. Rick stopped talking during meals. He stopped making eye contact. He stopped asking questions. He did what he was told. No more, no less. Even his walk changed. He shuffled, his arms drawn tightly to his body like a man trying to disappear into himself. And in many ways, he succeeded. The power structure didn't just dominate Rick, it exploited the attention he brought with him. Whenever new prisoners arrived, they were introduced to Rick like some kind of spectacle. "Have you ever watched Pawn Stars?" someone would ask, grinning widely. Then they'd push Rick forward, making him say a line from the show or appraise a toothbrush. Laughter would follow, always laughter, and Rick would stand there with a blank face, enduring each second. Some might wonder, why didn't the guards intervene? Why didn't the prison officials break up this blatant abuse of power? The answer, according to those inside, is bleak. They saw him as a self-solving problem. As long as Rick didn't start fights, as long as he kept his head down and stayed silent, they didn't have to worry about him. He was a model prisoner on paper. Quiet, compliant, no written complaints, no outbursts. What happens inside the prison economy wasn't their concern. And as for his suffering, it was seen as part of the process. After all, the guards had their own hierarchy to follow. They had rules to enforce, quotas to meet, and superiors to report to. A prisoner who caused fewer problems meant less of a headache. Rick didn't matter to them. He was just another number. But numbers don't cry. And Rick quietly wept at night, his sobs barely audible on his pillow. Dante had seen it. Others had heard it too. They could hear it through the thin walls, the soft, broken sobs of a man who once commanded millions of viewers, now nothing more than a pawn in someone else's game. In those moments, away from the cameras, the yard, and the performances, the truth became undeniable. Rick Harrison was no longer a man navigating prison life. He was a man owned by it. When a man reaches the point where his sense of reality begins to erode, when every breath is measured in humiliation and every hour marked by fear, something must give. In Rick Harrison's case, that giving didn't come from a confrontation, a collapse, or even an explosive outburst. It came from a quiet surrender, a silent decision to numb everything. The fear, the memories, his very identity. That surrender led him to the prison's psychiatric ward, what the prisoners called the loop. They called it that not only because of its circular design, but also because those who entered it seemed never to leave the same. Some never left at all. Some got trapped in a cycle of medication, a revolving door of pills designed to sedate, stabilize, and suppress. Rick had stepped into the shell of the person he once was. Those who came out were even less recognizable. The journey began right after one of the harsh pawn shop sessions. He had been forced to appraise a dead rat placed on a lunch tray as a joke. The crowd howled. Rick stared at it for over a minute, his expression unreadable before murmuring, "Market value? Nothing. It's ironic. It misses the point." That night, he was found sitting in the corner of his cell, knees pulled to his chest, slightly rocking. His cellmate called for help. The guards arrived and, seeing no immediate signs of physical pain, called in a nurse. After a brief observation, they took Rick to the mental health unit for further evaluation. Inside the mental health unit, the world was different, quieter, colder. The buzzing of fluorescent lights replaced the surrounding noise of patients screaming. The room smelled of antiseptic and loss. Patients walked slowly, dragging their feet after being administered medication. Some muttered to themselves, while others stared at the walls as if they were watching memories play on an invisible screen. Rick was isolated for 72 hours, standard procedure. During that time, he said nothing. He didn't eat much. He didn't ask for anything. He simply existed. A prison psychiatrist named Dr. Haskins was assigned to his case. In her later notes, which were leaked by an insider, she described Rick as indifferent, non-responsive, and displaying typical symptoms of trauma-induced dissociation. She prescribed him a cocktail of medications, an SSRI for depression, a mild anticonvulsant to stabilize his mood, and a sedative to help him sleep. He began the medication that night, and within a few days, the changes became evident. Rick started moving more slowly. His speech, already sparse, became mechanical. He nodded when spoken to, but rarely responded with more than a word. When he returned to the general population, he didn't revert to his old patterns. He didn't even resist when the other prisoners resumed their humiliating routines. He simply went along with it. There was something in his eyes that had disappeared, Dante remembered. It was as if whatever remained of Rick Harrison had been checked out, leaving only this slow-moving version. The medication had taken care of his anxiety, but it also took care of everything else. The insomnia from stress had vanished, replaced by hours of deep sleep. The trembling in his hands had stopped. The nightmares, too, at least those that had woken him with screams. But instead, there was a strange calmness, more like resignation than recovery. And the cycle didn't stop. Over time, Rick's dosage was adjusted. Increased, then decreased, then increased again. New medications were added, some to help with digestion, others to address the side effects caused by the first round of treatments. He began attending weekly mental health checkups. For the staff, he was a compliant patient, low maintenance. He followed every instruction, but to the other inmates, he had become an unbeatable prop, an orange mannequin. One of them described it like this: "He's like a vending machine. You press the right button, and he spits out whatever you want. An evaluation, a joke, an agreement to a deal. But there's no one inside anymore." This is what the loop did to everyone. It didn't break them with violence. It sedated them into submission. And Rick, already psychologically fragile, easily fell into the rhythm. Eventually, he stopped reacting even when physically provoked. During an incident in the yard, an inmate shoved him hard enough to knock him to the concrete. Rick didn't fight back. He didn't even say anything. He simply stood up, brushed off his clothes, and continued walking. It was survival, yes, but it was also something deeper, a profound detachment to the point that many began to wonder if Rick even recognized what was happening around him anymore. The psychiatrist monitoring him continued to note in an internal report, the subject displays signs of prolonged trauma response, appears compliant but emotionally disengaged, possibly concealing significant internal distress. Then the dreams began, or rather, the confessions about them. Rick started to tell Dr. Haskins about recurring images, not nightmares, but distorted, unsettling scenes from his former life, playing out in warped and troubling ways. He dreamed of the pawn shop burning, customers turning into prisoners, his old co-stars Corey and Chumley turning their backs on him as the guards dragged him into the darkness. He also dreamed of the cameras. The cameras followed him through the prison, turning the entire nightmare into a new season of the show. The prisoners' laughter became part of the show's twisted format. The reviews were just another part of the sickening cycle, and the worst part, he said, was that he couldn't tell if he was awake or asleep anymore. He began calling the prison the setting. The psychiatrist noted that this marked the potential onset of institutional psychosis, a term used when long-term prisoners begin to blur the lines between reality and delusion as a way of coping with the trauma. His medication was adjusted again. At one point, Rick was placed on temporary suicide watch after another inmate reported that he had been hoarding pills. The guards found several pills hidden under his mattress, each one wrapped in a corner of toilet paper. Rick claimed that he had been keeping them in case things got too loud again. It wasn't a clear admission of suicidal intent, but it was enough to warrant stricter monitoring. The loop had officially absorbed him. And while he still walked, ate, and spoke in small increments, Rick no longer fully existed. The man who once analyzed centuries-old artifacts, who debated the authenticity of coins and rifles, had become a man who no longer asked questions, no longer cared for the answers. Even the scale grew bored with him. They began using others for trade transactions. They let Rick fade into the background. He still had to appear to perform for an hour, but now it was more symbolic than functional. The crowd laughed less. The routines became repetitive. And Rick? He just sat there, blinking slowly, reciting lines like an actor who had forgotten the script. Eventually, rumors began circulating that prison staff were considering transferring him to a long-term mental health unit at another facility. The administration was divided. Some believed he was just pretending to be broken to avoid danger. Others saw a man truly crushed by the weight of humiliation and fear. Either way, he was no longer considered a threat or even a participant. He had become a symbol, a cautionary tale, the face of what could happen when power fades, and when the only way to survive is to stop feeling altogether. The man who once stood at the center of his own empire, who had sold deals, stories, and nostalgia to millions of viewers across the United States, now sat in a plastic folding chair, staring at a visitation window where no one ever stood on the other side. Weeks passed since he had been granted visitation rights, but still, no one came. Not once, not his son, not his former colleagues, not a friend or acquaintance from the many decades of his fame. The harsh reality was undeniable. Rick Harrison had become completely isolated. Visiting days were something prisoners looked forward to, even those serving long sentences. It broke up the monotony. It reminded them, even if just for a moment, that there was still a world outside, people who still cared. For some, a visit meant a reason to keep going. Rick had once thought he would have someone, at least Corey, his son, the one with whom he had shared so many years, both in business and on national television. If not him, maybe an old friend from the pawn shop in Las Vegas, a lawyer, an agent, someone. But the seat opposite his booth remained cold and empty week after week. The guards didn't even try to hide their amusement anymore. One of them, a thin man with a permanent smirk, referred to Rick's spot as the cold bench. When Rick arrived and signed in, the guard would glance at the screen and say, "No one today, Rick, but you can sit and wait. Maybe someone stuck in traffic from 2010. At first, Rick would wait the full 30 minutes each time, staring at the door, pretending it might open. After the fifth absence, he stopped showing up altogether. He simply signed in and left. The guard started laughing louder. Still, he checked the list. He told another guard that hope doesn't easily die. There were many theories among the prisoners about why no one came to visit Rick. Some thought his family had disowned him. Others believed that his loved ones were afraid for their own reputations. After all, publicly associating with a man convicted of human trafficking and money laundering wouldn't do any favors for anyone's image, especially someone like Corey, who was still active in the public eye and had his own ongoing business ventures. But the truth was far more complicated. According to leaked court documents, Rick's family had legally severed all financial and communication ties with him right after his conviction. Corey Harrison, in a rare public statement, said, "What my father did, I cannot explain. I cannot justify it, and I cannot support it. I have to protect my own future." It wasn't just a lament. It was a razor's edge. Every call from Rick was blocked, every letter returned unopened. He, as one inmate cruelly put it, had been socially cremated. It wasn't that Rick hadn't tried. In the first weeks, he wrote dozens of letters, some to Corey, some to industry friends, some to actors he hadn't spoken to in years. One inmate even said Rick had tried to reach out to a fan club asking for just one encouraging message. None of them received a response. One day, Rick sat in the yard, his back turned to the others, clutching a tattered envelope he had just received back. On it, the words, "Return to Cinder," were written. The handwriting on the outside was his. His name looked small, curled in on itself. He didn't speak for hours. Other inmates noticed. Some mocked him. Others, more seasoned in the art of surrender, nodded in silent understanding. Not sympathy, just recognition. It wasn't just the absence of visitors in a physical sense. It was the silence that followed. In prison, you learn to crave noise. Noise means life, activity, emotion. But Rick's world was filled with silence. No letters, no phone calls, no outside conversations, no appeals filed on his behalf, no lawyers visiting, nothing. Even the public seemed to have turned away, where once his name was a daily trend, the echo fading as news cycles changed, new scandals arose, and Rick slowly faded from memory like an old rerun, no longer airing. The prison therapist noted the psychological trauma in a memorandum. The subject displayed signs of abandonment trauma, combined with public shame and the betrayal perceived in close personal relationships. There was evidence of behavior consistent with prolonged social isolation and identity dissociation. The worst part wasn't just the absence of visitors, it was that after a while, Rick stopped expecting anyone to come. And in prison, the loss of hope is more dangerous than any fight. Hope is what keeps prisoners from slipping into the abyss, what keeps them from falling into despair. Without it, even the strongest minds will succumb. Rick began to act differently. During meal times, he would take a tray, eat alone, and then return it without saying a word. In the yard, he walked in squares, never making eye contact. During mandatory group sessions, he rarely contributed, speaking only when directly asked. Some of the guards began calling him the Ghost. Others called him Rick the Gone. What they didn't see, what most people didn't see, was that Rick was grappling with something darker than fear. He was facing rejection. Not from strangers, but from those he had once built his entire life around. During a rare group therapy session, another inmate mentioned that his daughter had come to visit him. Rick flinched slightly, but enough for the counselor to notice. After the session, she asked if he wanted to talk about it. He refused. But later he wrote a note in a notebook and left it on her desk. The message read, "They didn't just leave, they erased me." Those words haunted her. She shared it with another staff member, who noted that it was one of the most emotionally vulnerable statements Rick had made since arriving. Even in his darkest moments, he had never said anything like that. But eraser, forgotten by blood, was a quietly bleeding wound. Then came the final blow. Rick learned that his name had been removed from the birth certificate of his youngest grandchild. A legal move made by Corey's lawyer, citing moral reasons and the need to protect the child from an ongoing public disgrace. Not just symbolic, but the final decision. When Rick read the court summary sent to him as part of a delayed series of legal documents, at first, he didn't react. He sat still, then neatly folded the papers, placed them under his mattress, and lay down on his bed. He didn't get up for the rest of the day, not for roll call, not to eat. He just lay there, staring at the ceiling, the flickering light from the prison lamp casting shadows that danced like ghosts on the wall. The silence grew louder, and Rick Harrison, the man who once had answers, suggestions, and jokes, finally realized that there was no one left to deal with anymore. He had mortgaged every relationship he had, and there was nothing coming back. In every prison, there is an unspoken understanding. The guards are not just there to enforce the rules. They are there to maintain order, to keep the balance between chaos and control, to prevent the structure from collapsing under the weight of its own violence. But sometimes, order does not mean fairness. Sometimes, it means allowing things to happen, not because they are right, but because stopping them would expose something deeper, something more dangerous. And in Rick Harrison's case, what began as indifference developed into complicity. It started with small moments. A missing towel here, a rejected consignment order there. The things he was supposed to receive, soap, toothpaste, basic essentials, were mysteriously marked as issued in the system, but never handed to him. Rick quietly filed reports. Patiently, but nothing happened. No investigation, no explanation, just shrugs and an empty staircase. Then came the mockery. It wasn't just, "I'll give you $3 for your soul." Rick didn't react. He knew better. But the message was clear. Not everyone in uniform was on his side, and that was just the beginning. As his diminished role on Pawn Hour grew more complex and dramatic, some of the guards began to show up not to intervene, but to observe. Some leaned against the fence, giggling quietly. Others recorded short clips on their phones, secretly capturing moments to be used as bargaining chips like the traits of a prisoner under guard. A few guards even placed bets on what Rick would say or do next. Would he cry? Would he tell a joke? Would he fall? It became a form of entertainment. And in a place where so little changed, where monotony suffocated every breath, entertainment was pure gold. But why didn't they stop it? Why didn't they intervene when Rick was clearly being humiliated, exploited, and pushed beyond his psychological limits? The answer is twofold, and it stems from politics and self-preservation. First, Rick wasn't seen as a threat. He didn't start fights. He didn't lose his temper. He was compliant, predictable, a perfect prisoner. Administratively, he was easy to manage. There were more pressing issues to deal with. Violent gangs, smuggling rings, escalating tensions in the yard. Secondly, and more insidiously, There was an incentive for the prisoners to handle Rick. He was a burden to them. One guard overheard someone saying, "As long as they keep him quiet and away from us, what do we care?" The general attitude among many officers shaped the environment where Rick became a pawn in the truest sense. The more degraded he became, the easier he was to manage. There was no reason to intervene unless something happened that couldn't be ignored, but eventually something did happen. Rick was attacked, not by stabbing, not by brutal beatings, but through a quiet, controlled act of domination in the bathroom. Two prisoners cornered him. They didn't say a word. One held his shoulder firmly while the other whispered something in his ear and slapped him 3 times hard across the face. When Rick reported it, contrary to every survival instinct in his body, he was taken to the infirmary. A nurse examined the red marks on his face and filled out a basic injury form, but the report went nowhere. No charges, no cell searches, no reassignment. Rick was sent back to his bed with a note from the guard captain. Stay away from unsupervised areas. That was the protection he received. Stay away from places where you could be attacked again. Dante, the inmate who had blown the whistle, confirmed that the guards knew who had done it. They knew. Everyone knew. But no one wanted to start a war over Rick Harrison. In prison, protection is a privilege. It isn't given freely. It's earned or bought. And Rick, stripped of his resources and reputation, could provide neither. Even when a female counselor tried to report his treatment during a weekly administrative meeting, she was dismissed. "He's handling it well," the captain said. "He doesn't ask for special treatment." The counselor replied, knowing no one was listening. Shortly after, she was reassigned to another unit. Even the guards who weren't actively involved in degrading Rick knew better than to get involved. There was a risk in siding with the wrong inmate, especially one caught up in the politics of gang exchanges. Rick had become a symbol. His compliance, humiliation, and silence were a form of status quo that no one wanted to disrupt. And so, the complicity deepened. When inmates stole items from his bed, the guards looked the other way. When his orders were blocked, they blamed it on administrative errors. When he began showing signs of severe weight loss, sunken cheeks, pale skin, sluggish movements, they noted it as a side effect of medication-induced anorexia. But behind the scenes, there were whispers. Not everyone agreed with the silence. One unnamed junior officer said, "I tried to help him once, just once." He had slipped him an extra meal. The next thing I knew, my locker had been broken into. A warning. That was the severity of it. He was untouchable, but not in the way people think. More like radioactive. No one wanted to be near the fallout. For his part, Rick seemed to accept it. He stopped filing reports, stopped asking questions. When he lacked personal hygiene items, he made do. When his shoes were stolen, he wrapped fabric around his feet. When the guards passed by during the pawn hours, he didn't even look up. He had learned the most important survival rule in prison. Silence was safer than the truth. Even when rumors about him being injected with something spread after Rick collapsed and inmates claimed he had been injected without his consent, the guards ignored it. They said it was a side effect of his medication. They said he fainted due to low blood sugar. But when the medical report quietly mentioned the needle marks on his upper arms, wounds Rick couldn't explain, the whispers began again. The guards didn't conduct an investigation. However, the following week, they moved Rick to a more isolated top bunk, not to protect him, but to quiet the noise. Because by then, the truth was clear. Rick Harrison had become a burden no one wanted to deal with, a ghost everyone pretended to see, and a victim too complicated to protect. In such a system, complicity wasn't just common, it was policy. For many inmates, survival meant aligning with someone more powerful. But when that isn't possible, when you don't have a gang, no friends, no leverage, and no blood on your hands, survival becomes a transaction. And those transactions in prison are never clean. They come with unspoken costs, rising interest, and irreversible damage. Rick Harrison, a man who once made a living by determining what was valuable, was now living in a reality where everything, including his safety, had a price. The real problem was that he had nothing left to pay with. So, the system devised its own currency for him: humiliation, submission, silence. These became Rick's bargaining chips. The only things he could offer that still held value within the confines of a cage were truly scarce commodities, and favors became more lethal than helpful. The first time Rick paid for protection, it wasn't even his idea. One of the mid-level enforcers, a group that truly owned him at this point, approached him in the yard. The conversation was very casual, even polite, but the message was unmistakable. "You're lucky we're keeping the wolves away from you," the man said. "You don't get that for free." Rick said nothing. "I'm not asking for money," the man continued. "You don't have money. I'm asking for loyalty. You know how to talk, how to move things around. You know how to make people laugh, even when they want to slit each other's throats. You do that for us. You don't stop." Rick nodded. That was it. The deal was made. No paperwork, no witnesses, just a nod. But in prison, that nod was a contract written in blood. From that moment on, Rick's life was no longer governed by the rules of the prison, but by a private ledger of favors and expectations. When the scale needed something moved, a message was sent. A deal was brokered between the factions. A newcomer was assessed for usefulness. They turned to Rick, not because he was respected, but because he could be sacrificed. His tasks grew more dangerous over time. He was sent to unstable parts of the yard to deliver coded messages. If he refused, he was told to think about sleeping with one eye open. If he succeeded, he would earn a week of peace. When trade agreements went wrong, like when a shipment of cigarettes turned out to have something dirty in it, Rick was the one who had to apologize, smooth things over, and explain the misunderstanding. This wasn't negotiation, it was coercion disguised as diplomacy. In one situation, two rival factions almost came to blows after an inmate accused the scale of shortchanging him in a deal. Rick was pulled right into the middle, literally. They made him sit at a picnic table in the yard with both sides on either side and decided who was at fault. He was given 5 minutes to come up with an answer. He looked at the goods, a stack of ramen noodles, a half-used bottle of shampoo, and a pack of unmarked cigarettes, and said, it's fair, it's not fair." Everyone knew it wasn't true, but no one questioned him. The lie allowed both sides to save face. No one wanted confrontation, no one wanted to touch on the issues everyone knew, but no one wanted to mention. Rick was allowed to walk away, which wasn't surprising in such an environment. However, that night, a new piece of paper appeared in his bed. It only had a few simple words. "Well done." That was what he had done, and it was also how he managed to extend his existence for another week. 1 week. That might be all he could hope for in this situation. In a place where one wrong word could get you beaten, stabbed, or even killed, Rick survived week by sheer luck and perseverance. Nothing was simple. He was playing a game he didn't fully understand, with rules that changed daily and were impossible to predict. These rules were constantly shifting, keeping him on the edge of danger at all times. And with each passing week, the cost of protection kept rising. Regular deals were no longer enough to keep him safe. Everything was starting to get more tense than ever before. When monetary transactions were no longer enough, the scale began to demand things of greater value: personal items. First it was socks, shoes, underwear, then razors, things he never imagined he'd have to sacrifice. But it seemed this was inevitable. Even the only photo he had, a worn, bent, old snapshot of his son and grandson, a photo that had been tucked deep inside his Bible, wasn't spared. That photo was snapped, sold for just enough to buy 2 bags of chips and a pair of headphones. Rick said nothing. He just stayed silent. Even as everything around him slowly descended into chaos, he remained quiet because he understood that sometimes silence was the only way to survive. But then one day they asked him to do something he could never have imagined. His name. They wanted him to sign a message addressed to a government official, a letter disguised as a request from the inmates. The content of the letter was vague, filled with coded words and subtle language designed to facilitate the transfer of a guard from one area to another, an area controlled by influential criminals. Rick hesitated. He looked at the letter, then glanced around. All he had was one decision: sign or not sign. But he couldn't do nothing. The scale couldn't stop demanding sacrifices. He wondered if he still had any control left. Could he survive without doing what they asked? One of them asked, "This isn't Vegas, pawn man. You don't get to price things here." At that moment, he had no choice but to sign the letter. The message was sent. Within a week, the guard was transferred. And the reward Rick received was a week of uninterrupted sleep. No threats, no assignments to dangerous tasks. A brief pause in his hell had become his existence. That's what Rick Harrison called protection. Not a wall surrounding him, but a chain around his neck, something invisible yet always present, tightly bound to his life. An illusion of safety, bought with the sacrifice of dignity. A few hours of peace, but also filled with silence, submission, and self-betrayal. Each day that passed, he realized more that this protection meant nothing when it came at the cost of so much. Then one day, it happened. A rare visit, not from a lawyer or family, but from a federal investigator disguised as a public safety liaison. The man asked Rick only one question: "Are you safe?" Rick looked down at the floor, too afraid to meet the investigator's eyes. He answered wearily, "I'm fine." The investigator nodded, scribbled something, and then left. The conversation lasted only 4 minutes. However, just 2 days later, Rick's cell was ransacked. Nothing was taken, but everything was disrupted. His mattress was slashed, books torn apart, and the sink was clogged with his only toothbrush stuck deep in the drain. The message was clear. He had been watched, and there was no escaping it. No one said anything. Everything continued like an endless cycle that never stopped. Even when he tried to play by the rules kept changing. The regulations were never fixed. The cost of protection kept rising, and Rick had nothing left to give. That's when they turned to humiliating him again. During a pawn hour, an inmate forced Rick to appraise his own shoes, now discolored, cracked, and nearly unwearable. Those shoes were the last thing he had left to hold on to, but now they held no value either. Rick looked down at them, shrugged, and said helplessly, "Not much left." Another inmate sneered, just like the others. They laughed. Rick didn't. He knew the truth. He had pawned everything: his name, his pride, his memories, even his silence. And in return, all he got was the bare minimum. No harm, no targeting, no attention from the bad ones. But the price he paid for that safety was something he could never accept. Yet deep down, Rick understood another truth. In prison, nothing comes for free. Not even safety, especially not safety. Because safety isn't just a cost, it's a debt. And Rick Harrison was drowning in that debt, unable to escape. With each passing day, Rick felt the painful truth more deeply. When he thought he had paid enough, another demand arose. A new transaction. Another debt to be repaid. The things he had lost could never be reclaimed. And the things he hoped to hold on to were slipping through his fingers. The debt wasn't just material or the items he had pawned. It also encompassed the intangible, his self-respect, his freedom, even his peace of mind. Those debts could never be fully paid off. And with every day that passed, that debt grew larger. Rick couldn't shake the feeling that he was living in an endless nightmare with no escape. He did everything to maintain his safety, but could never be sure he wouldn't pay a heavier price the next day. He had been swept into a whirlpool with no way out. The cost of survival in prison, the protection he received, wasn't a guarantee. It was only temporary, a fleeting moment stretched thin like a small flame ready to flicker out at any time. He looked around, realizing that everything he had, from personal belongings to the rare moments of peace, was paid for with the price of his existence. Every day that passed, he owed someone, and that debt kept piling up, growing larger and larger, never to be fully repaid. Rick Harrison understood that in this world, safety wasn't free protection. It was a transaction that could never end, and he would have to pay for it for the rest of his life, until the debt eventually consumed him. If you find this story exciting and full of surprises, don't forget to hit the like button and share the video with your friends and those around you. Leave a comment below to let us know what you think. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our other exciting videos. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.